shaken yet standing firm. This is Radio Cayman in the Cayman Islands.
Live from Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. I'm Simon Caudry and I'm joined this morning, I hope, by my co-host Georgie Loxton. Georgie, can you hear me and are you well this morning?
I can hear you, Simon, and I'm great this morning. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. As I say, we are joining each other remotely as opposed to in the studio due to the continued restrictions on transport and travel. But we will nevertheless put forward a interesting and entertaining show we sincerely hope for you. As I say, we continue to broadcast again from our respective homes. Last week we had, the last show rather, we had a small technology snafu, which I hope does not reappear this week. If it does, we will fix it and continue moving on. Now, today's show is going to look at a little bit of psychology and assess its broader implications for humans as they deal with fear and panic and how it can cause irrational behavior or decision-making that is erroneous and potentially dangerous. We say these things not as psychologists, although if there is anyone listening who is a psychologist or psychiatrist and would like to join us for a discussion of the human mind and the tricks it plays, we would be absolutely delighted to have you on the show for a full segment to discuss this in some more detail. Rather, though, we say it as investment professionals whose industry has spent probably the better part of 15 years grappling with and obtaining in the process a few Nobel Prizes, but as I say, grappling with the fact that humans are not androids who behave in rational ways. Grappling with because it's been a shock to the economics and finance industry, but a shock that nevertheless is true. It resulted in a terrible set of reckonings for most economists as we move towards the realization that our assumptions of how humans behave wasn't correct. And it moves us towards having to realize that humans behaved in ways that weren't predictable necessarily based on straight, ordinary economic theory. So with that ringing in our ears, I want to turn straight away to Georgie and delve into our conversation with the starting question: what exactly is risk and why is it important to us as humans? Over to you, Georgie.
Simon, it's such a good question. Yeah, as you say, we finance professionals realize that humans are humans. I think that was really like a key moment. But what is risk? This is a really good question because we as investment professionals think about risk a lot. I mean, we're always trying to manage it. And there are so many different ways you can think of risk. I mean, the academic version of risk in investing is the standard deviation of returns. But I don't think that most human beings, when you talk about risk to them, are thinking about the standard deviation of the returns in their portfolio, are they?
I don't know what you mean. I think about it hourly, Georgie. It's what my life involves, standard deviations. No, I'm kidding. I know I think you're absolutely right. Most people wouldn't, first of all, know how to calculate it, and concepts which use Greek letters are never healthy for the most of humanity.
So they're thinking about uncertainty, or they're thinking about the probability that an outcome won't be as expected, or really the possibility, I think, of something bad happening. That's what people are thinking about when they think about risk. And it's really important that we communicate that clearly, because the way in which we communicate it impacts how people think about the risk that they're facing. My friend Carl Richards, who writes for the New York Times, he describes it as risk is what's left over when you think you've thought of everything. It's a good definition. Risk is what's left over when you think you've thought of everything. So, I think
it's
really
the stuff you can't predict, then, isn't it? Or the stuff
exactly.
that you don't know, stuff you don't know that is going to happen, stuff that happens which you had no inkling of, or maybe you should have had an inkling but failed to anticipate it, or you got caught up in some emotional matter and therefore didn't think about things rationally and properly and evaluate all the options. It's those things that you failed to adequately take account of, then, is what you're saying.
Yes, and I think that word emotional is incredibly important here, because we humans make decisions emotionally, whether we like to think about it that way or not. Many people I think don't like to think that their emotions come into their decision making, but if you understand a little bit about your brain, and maybe we'll go there now, then you have to understand how we process information and how we use our emotions to process information. So I actually studied biology at university. So, this sort of takes me back to my days. I won't say how many years ago, but it's really important to understand that our brains haven't changed really in about 150,000 years. And if you think about the world in which our brains were operating in 150,000 years, it's very different to the world in which we operate today. So, 150,000 years ago, we were busy, pursuing wild animals and foraging for edible plants, and we were preoccupied with finding mates and avoiding predators, and pretty much just making sure that our genes lived on till tomorrow. That's what our brains are wired to do. They're really just wired for survival. And they're also wired to do as little as possible because our brains use 25% of our calorific energy. So they use 25% of our calories. So if you think back to 150,000 years ago, our brains didn't really know when they were going to get their next square meal. So if your brain was busy using 25% of your energy and you didn't know when you were going to eat again, your brain had a very clever way of using as little energy as it possibly could. And it wanted to think, therefore, as little as it could. So your brain is very, very lazy, and it wants to do as little thinking as it can. So it therefore jumps to conclusions. It sees patterns when patterns don't exist. It uses what we call heuristics, which is a bunch of rules or shortcuts to, come to a decision instead of thinking through things, with that, what we call the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain at the front, which does the actual reasoning and thinking. Instead, it's using what we call the amygdala quite often, which is at the back of your brain, the two almond-shaped structures right at the back of base of your neck, which are responsible for what we call a fight or flight response, which is what, if you saw a snake or someone threw a snake in your lap, it's what's going to make you jump up and scream and run. Now, we use our fight or flight response, I should say, kicks in all the time, and it kicks in a lot when we come to investing, even though the risk that we face, as an investor is not a life or death risk. Our brain thinks it is. It's responding that way.
So what you're saying then, if I'm no biologist, and I'm glad that one of us has a great level of expertise in this area, because it's vital to have the context to this rather than reading the academic literature sometimes is informative, but not necessarily helps with the context that you've gone through. What you're saying, as I understand it then, is that human evolution or any evolution takes so many thousands of years, and it probably hasn't caught up with the rapid advancement of where we are in society, insofar as we don't have to worry generally about predators.
Right. We're not being chased by lions down the street.
Yeah. And so our brain has the capacity to do more, but it's still in that mindset of a few hundred or thousands of years ago, whereby it was trying to run away from things and therefore only performing those flight or fight type of mentalities, and as yet hasn't properly adjusted to the new environment in which humanity has found itself in a relatively recent period of time.
Exactly. That's exactly it. I mean, unless we're fighting a war, we're not really facing life or death situations on a daily basis like our brains were or our ancestors were 150,000 years ago. And we are descended directly from those that survived. And those that survived were those that feared the most.
Yeah.
Because if there was a rustle in the undergrowth, and it could have been the leaves or it could have been a lion, you responded as though it was a lion, or our ancestors responded as though it was a lion. They are the ones that survived, the ones that stood around thinking and reasoning to themselves, well, there's probably a 95% chance that it's the wind rustling the leaves, but maybe there's a 5% chance that it's a lion, so I think I'll stay still. They're the ones that got eaten by the lion.
Yeah. So in other words, what you're saying is genetically the dominant gene that transcribed itself all through or throughout human history to where we are today is that which was more fearful than that which was more relaxed about what's going on.
Exactly.
And therefore, what we need to realize, and sort of drawing this now into the general theme of this show, which is about investing, drawing that into that is if we are as humans are generally if we are generally influenced by a fear gauge which lingers within our brain subconsciously, whether we like it or not, then we need to be mindful of what that means in terms of decision making, because it can lead us, or it could lead us, to making erroneous decisions or dangerous decisions because we're not properly and rationally behaving or evaluating the options that are on the table. That's
absolutely true. And it's, of course, heightened during periods like this, periods where we're stressed, where we're anxious, where we are more fearful, our decision making is compromised in our brain, in that our prefrontal cortex is actually shut down. So when you go into fight or flight response, your prefrontal cortex, the bit where you actually think, actually shuts down. And there's some amazing kind of biological things that happen, like your pupils dilate and your hearing becomes heightened. Your stomach and your digestion shuts down. Your body gets pumped full of adrenaline. Now, these things are happening. You don't really realize they're happening to you. But when you feel stressed or anxious, your brain is not actually able to process the information clearly that is in front of it.
Interesting, because there was a HBO, Showtime, one of those TV stations. They had that TV show, which I'm sure a lot of listeners may have tuned into, Billions, which was about a hedge fund out of Connecticut or nearby New York. And they got up to a lot of dodgy stuff, but one of the things that they did do was to hire a psychologist or psychiatrist, I forget what the lady was, to help guide them and help try and adjust their decision-making based on the facts of who they are and how they're behaving given the circumstances. And that was based somewhat on real life, because a number of hedge funds do actually do that sort of thing. So we as ordinary investors, not only are we potentially fighting against people with superior information, superior technology, processing powers in computers, superior resources, but we're also fighting against people when we make investments who are better informed about their own psyche, about human psyche. And that makes it quite a dangerous proposition in terms of the average investor as to how we can make money, doesn't it? Because you're fighting against an unlevel playing field where other people have better understood exactly what you're talking about and have done something about it.
Yes, I would go a step further and say what people are really fighting against, though, as investors, is themselves. It's your own brain that you have to deal with. Like, I forget who said it, but our greatest enemy is ourselves. I think maybe it was Ben Graham. And that's what we have to deal with, is our own behavior, and understand that, and understand how that is really the key thing that's determining our long-term financial success. It's not really what we know, Simon. It's more about what we do. It's not so much about what we know. It's much more about what we do. And I think this is a hard thing maybe for highly intelligent, educated financial professionals to accept, that it's much more about our behavior and managing our own behavior and the behavior of our clients, of course, than it is about, actually having superior knowledge.
And that leads to then the obvious question, I suppose, which people listening to this will go, well, thanks very much on a Thursday morning for making me all pessimistic about the fact that I've not only got the world out there to contend with, I've not only got what everyone else is doing, but I've also got what's innate to me, and I've got to fight against that to optimize my outcomes. But that doesn't mean that we're at a loss as to what to do. It means that we simply have to educate ourselves about how our personalities or how our brains are behaving, and then take adjustments as a result, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think that one of the most liberating things that we can find out as an investor is that it's really about what's going in our own brain, rather than what's going on out there, because we've got control over that. We can ultimately control our own behavior. We can't control what happens in the stock markets. We can't control, what happens with inflation. We can't control what's going on with the economy and with COVID and all the rest of it. But we can control our own behavior. And that ultimately, as I said, is the thing that's really going to matter over the long run. I mean, comparing yourself to the guy down the street or to a benchmark or to anything else is useless, really. It's what's going on in your own personal finance, how close you're getting to wherever it is you want to go, and you control that directly.
Well, that's going to lead, I think we're going to take a short break right now, but I think what we should do after the break then is try and assess some of the common things that we often as humans get wrong when it comes to investing, and perhaps not just investing, but when it comes to decision making, because investing is about decision making, but decision making can apply in a whole range of other areas. But there's probably 30, 40 different things that we should be more mindful of, but perhaps we can try and explore some of the more common ones and then try and address what we should be doing about those. So we're going to take a short break now, but join us again in about a minute or so as we continue our conversation with Georgie on risk management, humanity, and potentially even our future.
The Ministry of Tourism is establishing a needs registry for displaced Caymanian tourism employees. This information will be used for review of necessary support for the tourism sector. Caymanian tourism employees are asked to complete the online registration form available at tourismregistration.ourcayman.ky. Sign up today to be included.
The Cayman Islands government wishes to advise the public that they will continue to distribute reusable cloth masks across the Cayman Islands with the assistance of the RCIPS Community Police Officer and Community Safety Officer in your areas. Officers will be visiting homes in all districts over the next few weeks, and a limited supply of both disposable and reusable masks will also be available at supermarkets. Remember, you are required to wear a mask when indoors in any public place and when using public transportation. Continue to maintain a minimum of 6-foot distance at all times from persons who do not live in your own household, and wash hands frequently. Stay safe, Cayman.
This is Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense, and thank you for joining us again this morning with Georgie Loxton as we continue our conversation on understanding risk, understanding the human mind, and what it means for our decision-making process. Now, Georgie, before the break, we talked at some length about some of the key psychological things or behavioral things that are going on inside our brain and how important it is to understand those. Let's perhaps try to personalize it in a sense with some actual practical examples of things that we typically as humans do very badly, and then perhaps what we can do about those, or how we can change our behaviors or change our understanding to improve those things.
Yeah, it's a great question, Simon. So, I mean, I think they've listed something like 400 different behavioral biases. Is that correct? I know it's hundreds. But I think probably the most important one that we all, not just as investors, but as humans should be aware of, is something called confirmation bias, which is where when we form a belief about something, and this could be a political belief, it could be an opinion on a stock, but when we form that belief, we go out and we seek information that confirms that belief or that opinion that we have. And we place greater weight on information that supports our belief. So this is a real problem because it turns out that it's very hard for us as humans to sort of admit that we might be wrong. And they've done studies. There was a famous study, I think it was published in Nature magazine, where participants were shown evidence that countered their political beliefs. And when they looked at what was going on in their brains, they saw that the part of your brain that's associated with physical pain becomes more active. So when people are shown information that counters, say, a political belief or a religious belief, in a belief about an investment thesis, it's actually hurting us to see, actually physically hurting us. We don't feel the pain, but our brain does, to look at this information that counters the opinion that we have come to. And of course, it's really, really important to look at the other side of any argument, because we always have to admit that we might be wrong. And that's very hard for us. So as individuals, I think it's so important to always be looking at the other side of an argument and trying to ask ourselves, how could I be wrong about this?
I guess it's to put that into a different context. We often see, to use the U.S. political system as an example, or a lot of people in the U.S. are devotees, disciples almost, of one particular party or one particular news channel, whether it be Fox or MSNBC. And even when evidence is clearly showing that something is wrong, people aren't willing to listen to it, aren't even willing to listen to the other side. And so we can all, I think everybody in Cayman can probably look at political systems around the world and go, how ridiculous is it that people are so single-minded about something, as opposed to being a little bit more open-minded to the faults of somebody or to the errors that they've made. But that's simply on a magnified scale. That doesn't mean that we also ourselves don't exhibit that in our investment decision-making. You're saying that people become overly emotionally attached to something, and when there's a piece of evidence, though, we've got a pandemic and someone's an investor in an airline stock the day before, they say, no, it will be absolutely fine. The pandemic is completely irrelevant to the airline industry until the airline goes bankrupt, at which point they don't have a choice but to accept it. But that's how people are actually behaving. People don't respond correctly to new information and don't sensibly accept new information and change their opinion, is what you're basically saying by this bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, we seek out and we place a greater weight on information that confirms the belief that we have. And there's no reason why we should place a greater weight, of course, on information that confirms what we believe. We need to place equal weight on all the information and all the facts that are presented to us. But we're not very good at that as humans.
I suppose to draw another analogy, and I don't want to go down a dangerous path of pretending that I'm a molecular biologist or epidemiologist or anything like that, but an example you could use in this pandemic is at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're talking about investing, but to use different examples to illustrate that, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, we must stay inside because it's highly transmissible, highly contagious, and high levels of death rates. 10% of people who get it will die. The evidence clearly shows that to be false. I mean, there's no ambiguity about that, and yet people still say that as though it's a religious mantra. And that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? The bias, which is that people don't change their mind based on changing evidence.
Absolutely. And it's very hard in the age of social media, of course, because so much of the information we're given is not based on facts. It's not factual information. And unless you are very good at verifying the source of the information that you get, and you make sure that where you're getting your information is actually the right sources, then it's very easy to come up with opinions and beliefs about things, and particularly this crisis, that, as you say, aren't true at all. I mean, it's so interesting when you go back to the beginning of this crisis and you think about risk and how we perceive risk and how risk is communicated, and you think, what was it that everybody was busy doing when this crisis started? What was the one thing everyone went out and did?
I think I was in a wine bar. Well, what's the actual answer?
Everyone went out and bought toilet paper.
Oh, yes. Well, I think I was still in a wine bar.
Back at that, we think that was bonkers. What was it about this, how we perceived the risk that caused us as humans to want to hoard toilet paper? It's very strange how we sort of reacted to that perceived risk on our life, and it was it was something to do with control. We wanted to be able to control something as humans, and there was an element of herding as well, which is something where humans don't like being left behind, because evolutionarily, if you were in a herd, you were safe. If you were at the back of the herd or you were the lagger, you were the one that was going to get picked off. So we humans very much like to be part of a herd. We are herd creatures. So when you see a bunch of people going out buying toilet paper, you follow that herd and you should go out and buy the toilet paper too. It's very interesting.
So what's the solution here then? Is this from my vantage point as I listen to this, it seems to me that the only avenue that can help us get out of that sort of rut of decision making is, in a sense, to surround yourself with people who knowingly often have different viewpoints to yourself, and which some people call weirdos, wackos, crazy people. But you need cognitive diversity, don't you, in order to be able to make better informed decisions. Because if you surround yourself with people who think alike, or who respond to the same input in the same output, you're not going to get different thinking and therefore different perspectives. Is that the solution? And I say that in the context of some of the most well-known investment management firms out there in the world who have spent many millions of dollars researching this. And what they tend to do is they tend to have team meetings about investments, and the CEO or the CIO, the head of the business, never speaks in those meetings. It's about allowing the junior person to put their thoughts through first, so that the rest of the meeting, the rest of the group isn't influenced by the seniority of somebody to continue the same thought process. You allow the crazy people, the naive, in a sense, the uneducated in that sense, to speak first, so that you can hear diversity of thought. Is that something we should all try to do more often in our own investing lives, in our own decision-making lives?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, cognitive diversity and as you say, diversity of thought is incredibly important. But I think just as an individual, I mean, particularly at the moment because we're, somewhat isolated from others, I think that the best thing we can do to try, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to make the healthiest choice, and we're trying to make our decisions and our choices as intelligently as we can. And so we want to make sure that we're using reason as opposed to emotion. And I think the way that we can do that is really just stop and pause often, particularly if we're scrolling through social media and seeing an article and, our emotions jump in and we want to respond to whatever that is. If we just step back and we pause and we try and bring more reason into that conversation that's going on, either in our minds or going on with somebody else, then I think that could be very helpful. And as I said, just particularly looking at that source of the information, who is it that's written that article? Who is it that's saying this thing? Where has that information come from? How reliable and trustworthy is it? I think that's a huge part of it because, as I said, we want to try and take that emotional response that's inherent within us out of it as much as we can. And Daniel Kahneman, who you'll know, who's a very famous behavioral psychologist, he's written books and books and books about this. He spent his whole life studying it, and he says that he's no better than the next person at counteracting this. The first step is awareness. We have to be aware of our biases, but it's a lifelong struggle, I think, to try and overcome them.
We're obviously, as we always do, we run desperately short of time on this show, but we've got a couple of more minutes before we have to wrap up. What other principal bias would you say that people should be more aware of? You've mentioned confirmation bias. What other bias would you like the listeners to be better informed about?
There's so many, aren't there? I think that right now framing is really important, and that's to be aware that how you process information depends on how that information is framed or how it is presented to you. So it depends on whether you're presented information in the context of a gain or of a loss. So, you can do this around health issues or around finance, but let's take an example and say, if I asked you, do you think you could retire on 70% of your current income? Most people will probably say, 70% of I could probably do that. If I present exactly the same information, but I say, do you think you could retire on a 30% reduction in your current income? Most people are going to go, 30% reduction? Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure I could do that. Now, that's exactly the same information. But the way it's framed means that we process it differently.
And I guess
and that's really important.
To use a context, we always sort of come back to where we are in the world today. Governments around the world are saying to their citizens, stay home to save lives. People will die if you go outside of your home. Of course, leaving aside the absurdity of the framing of such an important topic in a buzzword or a sentence less than 8 words. But the other alternative was, would everybody have accepted the draconian dictatorial type of steps that governments around the world have enacted if it were framed as 99.9% of you are at no risk, but stay home anyway? That's kind of what we're talking about, but it was, you will die if you don't stay home. Of course, the evidence was clearly not true, and it's been proven not to be true. But that's the framing, and people go, oh, well, now I'm so panicked about staying home. Even when you open things up, I can't possibly leave the house because I will die. I mean, that's kind of what's in people's psyche right now, I guess.
Absolutely, and we've lost all sense of risk around this crisis, of course, and people are unconsciously, of course, it's all unconscious, but many people are unconsciously doing much more risky behaviours right now than going outside. I mean, we were joking the other day, weren't we, about me saying that I was out on my evening runs and I keep seeing people on their bikes cycling, not wearing a helmet, but wearing a mask. Now, that is a very fundamental misconception around risk, because the risk of you contracting or the risk of you passing on this disease, if you look at the science and you look at the data, to anybody outside is very, very low.
Absolutely.
The chance of being knocked off your bike and having a serious head injury when you're not wearing a helmet are quite high.
Yeah. Well, we are as I pre-warned, we are almost out of time. Well, we are out of time now, I'm afraid. So, Georgie, again, a thoroughly entertaining conversation, and one that has left me needing to do more research on the very issues of human behavior, because it affects our investing lives so substantially. And we've drawn some analogies with the current health epidemic to frame this conversation so people can understand some of the context. But those who are listening, who are investors in the market, I would strongly encourage each and every one of you to do some more research on human behavior, because it's fundamental to getting better outcomes. And so, Georgie, thank you very much for helping begin our education process in this. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, Simon. That was fun.
Excellent. Well, as you all know, we are 2 weeks away from our next show. We are hoping, we had the recent announcement from the Ministry of Finance that they have an economic plan for Cayman. We are hoping to have the Minister of Finance on the show in the next couple of weeks or so stay tuned for announcements on that. We would like to be able to discuss the economic recovery path of Cayman and ask some sensible and pointed questions of that. But if you do have any other questions or topics you want us to cover, send us a tweet at Money Sense Radio or email us at moneysense@candw.ky. With that, thank you once again, and join us in 2 weeks' time for another edition of Money Sense.